Imagine you forgot to transfer $20, just $20. You're at a gas station, you swipe your card, and by the time you realize the account was a little short, it's too late. The transaction goes through. You fill up the tank, you drive home, and by morning, your bank has charged you $35 for the privilege of that oversight. You paid $35 to borrow $20 for about 8 hours. That's an annualized interest rate of over 5,000%. And the bank did it automatically, quietly, while you slept. Here's the thing. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't a glitch. That was a product, one that was designed, tested, optimized, and defended by some of the most expensive lawyers in the country. And every year, American banks collect somewhere between $8 and $15 billion doing exactly that, to exactly those kinds of people in exactly those kinds of moments. Not from the wealthy, not from corporations, from ordinary people on ordinary days making ordinary mistakes. This is how it works. Let's start from the beginning, because the beginning is where the trick is hidden. When you open a checking account at a major bank, you sign something called a deposit agreement. It's usually somewhere between 30 and 60 pages long. Almost nobody reads it. The bank knows this. In fact, they're counting on it. Buried somewhere in the middle of that document, usually in a section called Overdraft Services or Account Management, is a clause that says something like this: if you spend more money than you have, we may pay the transaction on your behalf and charge you a fee for doing so. May, not will. May. That word does a lot of work. It gives the bank discretion, and discretion in the hands of a company optimizing for revenue almost always moves in one direction. For decades, banks used that discretion to enroll virtually every new customer in overdraft protection automatically. You didn't opt in, you were just in. And unless you knew to ask, specifically by name using the right language, you stayed in. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau looked at this. They found that roughly 9% of account holders were responsible for nearly 80% of all overdraft fees. Not occasional overdrafters, chronic ones. People hitting the same fees month after month at the same institutions, sometimes on the same day of the month when their balance predictably runs low before a paycheck arrives. The banks knew who these customers were, they had the data, and they kept charging them anyway. Now, the banks will tell you this is a service, that paying the transaction rather than declining it saves customers from embarrassment, from failed rent checks, from declined grocery purchases. And look, there's a sliver of truth in that. If your rent check bounces, you might owe your landlord a late fee on top of everything else. If your car payment declines, there could be consequences. So yes, in some scenarios, covering the transaction has value. But here's where it gets interesting. Here's where the math stops being abstract. The average overdraft fee in the United States, as of recently, has sat around $30 to $35. The average transaction that triggers one is $24. So you're paying more in fees than the amount of money that caused the problem, every time, by design. And then there's something called transaction reordering. This one took years to become widely understood, and when it finally did, the class action lawsuits started almost immediately. Here's how it worked at several major banks, and some still do versions of this. At the end of each business day, the bank processes your transactions. Common sense says they do this chronologically. You bought coffee at 8 a.m., groceries at noon, paid a bill at 3 p.m. Process them in that order. Simple. But some banks reordered them, largest to smallest, so that big bill payment, the one that pushed your account negative, was processed first, even if you made it last. And suddenly, instead of one overdraft fee on the one transaction that actually overdrew you, you're paying fees on everything that came after. The math changed completely. One fee becomes 3, 3 becomes 7, and your account goes from briefly negative to catastrophically negative, and the bank collects the difference. Wells Fargo paid $203 million to settle a class action over exactly this practice. Bank of America settled for $410 million, TD Bank over $62 million, Wachovia another $203 million. They paid billions in settlements, and they still made money. That's how lucrative this was. But overdraft fees are just the beginning. Let's talk about the machinery beneath them. Banks, at their core, are in the business of lending money they don't entirely have. That's not a conspiracy, it's called fractional reserve banking, and it's how the entire modern financial system works. For every dollar you deposit, the bank is allowed to lend out somewhere between $8 and $10 depending on regulations and capital requirements. Your deposit becomes leverage. Their leverage becomes profit. So when you keep money in a checking account at Chase or Bank of America or Wells Fargo, you're not just storing it, you're funding their lending operations. And what do they pay you for that privilege? On a standard checking account, in most cases as of recent years, somewhere between 0 and 0.01% annually. Put $10,000 in a Chase checking account. After a full year, you might earn $1. $1. Meanwhile, that same bank is lending money at 24% on credit cards, at 7 or 8% on mortgages, at 6% on auto loans. They borrow from you at essentially 0 and lend back to the economy at rates many multiples higher. The spread between those numbers is called the net interest margin, and it is the engine of modern commercial banking. In 2023, J.P. Morgan Chase reported a net interest income of $89 billion. $89 billion from the spread, not from fees, not from investment banking, not from trading, from the difference between what they pay you for your money and what they charge everyone else to use it. And the reason they can get away with paying you almost nothing is simple. Most people don't move their money. It's annoying to switch banks. The inertia is enormous. Banks know this. They depend on it. The technical term economists use is switching costs, but you could also just call it what it is, the advantage of inconvenience. Now let's talk about credit cards, because this is where the architecture becomes almost elegant in its ruthlessness. You get a credit card offer in the mail, 0% interest for 18 months, no annual fee, cash back on every purchase, rewards points maybe, airport lounge access maybe. The pitch sounds generous because it is generous to one specific type of customer, the customer who pays their balance in full every month. If you do that, you're what the industry calls a transactor. You use the card, you get the rewards, you pay it off, and you pay them almost nothing. In fact, banks sometimes call this customer segment deadbeats, and not as an insult, as a technical term. Because from the bank's perspective, you're dead weight. You're using the infrastructure without generating the interest income they built the whole product around. The other customer, the one carrying a balance, paying the minimum or occasionally missing a payment, they call a revolver, and revolvers are who the card was built for. Here's what happens to a revolver. Let's say they carry a balance of $5,000 at 24% APR. That's about $100 a month in interest charges minimum. If they pay only the minimum payment, usually 2 or 3% of the balance, so somewhere around $125, almost all of that goes toward interest and almost none of it goes toward the principal. The balance barely moves, and every month it doesn't move, the bank collects again. Run the numbers on a $5,000 balance at 24%. If you pay only the minimum, you will be paying that card off for over 20 years, and you'll pay somewhere around $12,000 total on a $5,000 balance. The bank didn't just profit, they more than doubled their money over time, automatically, because you paid the minimum and moved on. And the rewards net, the cash back, the airline miles that feel like free money, those are funded almost entirely by the revolvers, the people who can least afford to be subsidizing the travel upgrades of wealthier cardholders are in fact doing exactly that. The entire reward economy is a wealth transfer, running quietly every single month. Let's zoom out now because this isn't just about individual products. There's a philosophy underneath all of this. Banks are regulated entities. They operate within rules. They fund lobbyists to help write those rules. They fund research that supports their positions. When the CPFB tried in 2024 to cap overdraft fees at $5 compared to the $35 average, the banking industry mobilized an enormous legal and political response. Dozens of banks filed or supported legal challenges. Trade groups called it regulatory overreach. Some members of Congress pushed back. As of early 2025, the fate of that rule remained deeply uncertain. That's the system working as designed. Not as a conspiracy. Conspiracy requires coordination and secrecy. This is just incentives. Banks are legally obligated to maximize returns for shareholders. Shareholders want growth. Growth requires revenue. Revenue comes, in part, from fees. And fees come disproportionately from the customers least able to fight back. There's a term in behavioral economics called present bias. It means that humans consistently overvalue what's in front of them and undervalue what's coming later. Banks, and the credit card industry in particular, have spent enormous resources understanding present bias. Minimum payment disclosures were made mandatory partly for this reason. If you show people only the minimum payment due, they pay the minimum. If you show them what paying only the minimum will cost them over time, they behave differently. Studies showed this clearly. Banks knew it long before regulators did. The design of financial products isn't neutral. The defaults aren't accidental. The size of the minimum payment field on your statement isn't a coincidence. Here's the uncomfortable part. None of this is illegal. Almost all of it was, at some point, disclosed, technically, somewhere in a document you didn't read, in language designed to comply with the law while obscuring the meaning. What the industry calls transparency, behavioral economists would call something closer to camouflage. And here's the real tension. Some of it genuinely is a service. Credit cards give people access to liquidity they wouldn't otherwise have. Overdraft coverage does occasionally prevent cascading consequences. The question isn't whether any value is delivered. The question is how the value is priced and who absorbs the cost. Because the math is not distributed evenly. A Federal Reserve study found that households earning under $30,000 annually pay overdraft fees at a rate roughly 12 times higher than households earning over $100,000. 12 times. The fee structure that generates billions in revenue is not a random tax on bad luck. It's a tax that hits hardest on people who are already closest to the edge. And that edge, the point where someone overdraws an account or carries a credit card balance or misses a payment, that edge is often not irresponsibility. It's a medical bill, a job loss, a car repair, a week where everything came due at once and the timing didn't work. The bank's algorithm doesn't care why, it just charges. So where does that leave us? A few banks have started moving away from overdraft fees. Ally Bank eliminated them. Capital One eliminated them. Some credit unions never had them. The CFPB's pressure campaign and the public attention that came with it pushed some larger institutions to reduce fees or increase the buffer before they trigger. Progress exists, but the fundamental architecture, the net interest margin game, the reward card wealth transfer, the minimum payment design, that's structural. It's not going away because a regulator wrote a stern letter. It's baked into how consumer finance works, and unwinding it would require either a profound shift in regulation or a profound shift in how people manage their money, or both. And most people, including most financially literate people, still leave money in low-yield checking accounts, still carry credit card balances, still read only the due date on their statement, not the total cost of minimum payments. Not because they're foolish, because the system is designed to be navigated with effort, and effort is finite. There's a question worth sitting with at the end of all this. If a system consistently extracts money from the people who can least afford it, and that system operates legally, transparently, technically, and with the full knowledge of everyone involved, including regulators, including legislators, including the customers themselves who signed the documents, is that a design flaw, or is it the design? The banks made $11 billion in overdraft fees last year. The number fluctuates, but it never disappears. It just gets called something else, repackaged, defended, and charged again, usually around the same time of month to the same people, in the same quiet, automatic way, while they slept. If this kind of breakdown is useful, this is exactly what the channel does. No hype, no shortcuts, just how the system actually works. Subscribing just means you won't miss the next one.